Welcome to By-The-Bywater, a podcast on the Megaphonic Network. I'm Ned Raggett.
I'm Oriana Schwint.
I'm Jared Pekacek.
And we're here to talk about all things J.R.R. Tolkien, his work, his inspirations and impact, creative interpretations in other media, languages, lore, rip-offs, parodies, anything we think is interesting. Thanks for joining us. Hello and welcome to the 48th episode of By-The-Bywater. It is great to be back with you all. Oh, we've got a lot to talk about. Oh, do we ever. However, we're just going to take the time first to celebrate the fact that Oriana decided to take that husband of hers and go celebrate their delayed honeymoon over in Europe. And we're not envious at all. He lied.
No.
It was actually, so we went to the Netherlands and Scotland, and oddly, it was like the most beautiful weather in Scotland. It was sunny. It was really sunny and beautiful. It was cold, but just saw some really cool trees. It was great.
All right. No, that sounds like a good way to do things. Meantime, just nothing but rain and gloom and nothing so bad quite here in San Francisco, not compared to other parts of the state. I will say this much. And I had my birthday the other day. Hooray for me. So, as far as I'm concerned, hurrah. So 52 years. How did that happen? Anyway, so life goes on. So, but anyway, there is, as we said, quite a bit to talk about. And there won't even be some news even right until the very end of the episode, but we'll get to that. However, we've got some major news that Jared here has much to talk about, but other things too. So please, at this point, do take it away.
So there's a few things to address, quite a few, starting off with something that's absolutely great. After a 4-month strike, the HarperCollins Union successfully gained a new contract, which was overwhelmingly ratified by its members. That was absolutely a heck of a hard thing to do, especially over the holiday season. So big shout out to them, and we hope things continue to improve for the best on that front. This also means that the general boycott on calling attention to newly released work by the company, which the union had asked for, is now ended. So at some point here, we will indeed look further into the new, or at least newish, Tolkien book, The Fall of Numenor. Meantime, to our extreme collective surprise, this one's a fun one. The Lord of the Rings musical, which we discussed as much as we could back in episode 16, is being revived for the first time since the West End production closed in 2008, with its original producer Kevin Wallace again backing it. This time around, it's being done as a smaller scale, immersive production at a noted English regional theater, the Watermill Theatre in Newbury, Berkshire, which will include staging for the opening and closing Shire sequences in its garden. The audience seating itself is only 200 people, as opposed to almost 2,000 for its original West End production, so we're assuming no overly complicated stage setups for actors to break their legs on. Don't want to get that immersive. At least, so we hope. If anything, since the original's run in Toronto and the West End as a mega musical production happened before the full explosion of social media, we may get some sense of what the actual book of the musical, however revised, is like this time. Tickets for shows between July and October this year go on sale later this month. Link in the show notes if you happen to find yourself in England. But no question. Yeah, I'm not going to. I'm going to fly to England just for that, and I'll report back. But the big news of the last few weeks has been on February 23rd, Warner Bros. Discovery CEO David Zaslav announced new studio heads Mike DeLuca and Pam Abdi had arranged a deal with Embracer, the Swedish firm which secured the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings licensing rights held for almost half a century by the Salzance-founded Middle-earth Enterprises last year. While exact plans aren't known, the upshot is that more movies are coming down the pike, on top of the long-in-the-works War of the Rohirrim anime due for release by Warner Bros. Next year. It's important to remember that, like the just-discussed musical, this is not an arrangement with the Tolkien estate, who maintain the overall rights to all the books directly. Again, these particular licensing rights were sold by Tolkien himself when The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings were the only published Middle-earth works, and Christopher Tolkien never authorized any further rights sale. The estate, so far, has continued that stance, and its own arrangement with Amazon for The Rings of Power was due to a TV carve-out in that original rights sale, totally separate from this new Warner Brothers Embracer deal. On balance, this is essentially returning to a status quo, a continuing extension of the Middle-earth Enterprises' New Line partnership started in 1997 by their respective corporate heirs, but given everything in terms of what exactly they're going to be trying to do without access to anything else in the published legendarium, and how cinematic universes that aren't Marvel have been turning out in general, get ready for weirdness.
Weirdness.
So look, I am entirely opposed to all of this unless with one huge caveat. If they will give me a movie to write, I am all for this, okay? Let me be perfectly clear.
The groundswell campaign starts here, and we ask you to all join in. It really needs to be done. So, of course,
it's going to be like 7 movies of like muddy cinematography and like,
oh man,
I don't know, Theoden origins, and it's going to be a nightmare.
No, I'm sticking with Tom Bombadil Quantumania. You know it's going to happen. So, but
I will write the Tom Bombadil movie. I will do it. Just ask. All you guys have to do is ask.
Yeah.
Zaz, all you got to do is just call me up. You have my phone number.
There is also one other news item about me, actually. I have a book coming out next year, summer 2024.
Yeah.
Tell us more about this book, Jared,
yes,
even though you've actually told us quite a bit over time that we haven't been able to talk about for obvious reasons. So.
Yeah. It's like I'm finally able to talk about it. This has been killing me, not being able to be like, well, you know, in my book, we do this. So it's like, it is called The West Passage. It is sort of a weird fantasy. I think of it as partly horror, but, you know.
Ooh.
We can link to the actual release in the show notes because I cannot remember what it says, and I'm really bad at summarizing my own work, but it takes place in a vast, crumbling palace. Think of like Gormenghast, populated by bizarre sort of Hieronymus Boschian creatures, and, you know, existential threat arises. Mortician nun and a librarian squire have to team up to save the world, basically. It's a lot of fun. There's lots of gigantic monstrous women in it, if that's your thing. So...
Oh, that sounds like you're targeting a very specific audience,
well, so
Jared.
this is... My editor, please don't listen to this part. I thought that was like the hardest thing to sell, but Tor is the publisher. Yes, I landed Tor. The marketing is really going hard on the like monsters women aspect, and I was like, really? That's the interesting part? Okay, like I'm such a fool. I thought that would not be the cool part. So,
ladies love monstrous women.
Girls love it when there's a woman who's a monster.
Yeah, can't get enough.
Yeah, they're like, it's all about like, oh, the giant ladies, and you know, and I'm like, is their size the most interesting part? I don't know. Okay, you know, but
you're targeting the step on me.
Yes,
contingent.
I did not intend to, but it turns out that I have. So,
wow, I am learning so much how publishing works and how marketing works, clearly in different ways.
Like I truly thought this would be a very unmarketable book because it is a lot weirder than my description made it sound. But I guess if you get the Step on Me crowd, which has been gotten,
they'll do it for you. They'll do it for you.
I am duly amazed. So, but yes, Oriana and I have been basically cheering Jared on ever since he broke the news to us that it was happening behind the scenes. As you know, we certainly weren't able to tell anybody either. We're just like, wink we say. So we are very, very thrilled to cheer him on with this. Needless to say, buy all the copies, etc. We will happily shill for our co-host here.
We'll make sure
you're going to hear it from us, and do everything, and superstar adaptations and all that other stuff, and all the rest of it.
Pre-order. Those are so important for new authors. Pre-order the
when
book.
there is a pre-order link.
Right. Yeah.
It will go in the show notes. It'll go in every episode.
Yeah. You'll just idly mention it when the time comes right. And the other thing too to note that I don't think you mentioned that you've illustrated it as well. Yes.
Yes, it will be illustrated.
That's so cool. So cool.
Yes, there is a lot going on with it.
That'll be wonderful. So by all means, just get ready to check that out. We'll again be hyping the heck out of that. Before we plunge into the episode in full, let's look back over some of this other news, shall we say? Well, the union news, of course, was fantastic.
Yeah,
that's great.
We can't cheer our HarperCollins enough. And a strike that length over the holidays is mentioned. Get credit to you guys sticking it through. That is really, really good to see. And it's nice to be able to, start talking about certain things again. Anyway, the musical revival. This is weird. Now, initially we thought it was a new musical, but then it turned out, it's the old one. It's like, but the old one had problems, as our episode discussed in depth.
I'm intrigued. And it's kind of a shame that none of us will see it in all probability. I don't anticipate taking another 10-hour plane ride across the pond. What new material will we see? What new clips will we get? I'm so curious. Like, what work have they done on it outside
it's
of
be like really retooled, at least
right
in terms of the actual staging, because there's no way that you could in a 200-seat theater do the Cirque du Soleil type nonsense that was happening.
I assume Galadriel will not be hovering in the heights as she was doing her song and all that. I remember we were marveling at that one. So, and yeah, no, it has to be. It's certainly unclear. I mean, the news was just announced a few days ago. I'm sure we'll get a little more with time, but it's absolutely unclear if there's been any new work done by the creative team. If it's just simply a straight up revival, it's certainly a new. It's not like the directors are returning or anything like that. And by default, this is meant to be scaled down. It could well be that this is given how much it did not make back its money. I don't know whether Wallace is trying
no way
to.
It could have.
Yeah, I mean, is Wallace? Yeah, I doubt Wallace is trying to chip away at that, whatever it is. I mean, again, it's been 15 years. My guess is nearly all the principals have just gone on and done other things. Of course, there was a comment years ago that Wallace apparently was saying that he'd like to take it on a tour to Australia and New Zealand in some way, shape, or form. My guess is, again, given the scale of it all, that was simply not happening. He could, however, be thinking, well, maybe there is a way to retool it down to be a simpler production and still have it work. We have a play. Maybe there's a way to do this a little differently. There's the whole immersive aspect where it's going to be starting and ending in the gardens. That's still sort of an extra thing that
I actually don't hate that. I don't hate that, incidentally. I will be on the record as being like, oh, I could see that being fun.
My objection is solely down to being extremely uncomfortable when anybody in a theater tries to get me to do anything.
That's the cat's problem.
Yeah, like if I'm going to wander around a garden full of hobbits, they have to pretend I'm a ghost. They cannot see me.
Oh yeah, we have to only be sitting in the garden, maybe eating. We cannot be no.
Like I can't be like Sam can't try to get me to dance or whatever. Like it's.
But you have to dance the Springle Ring.
No.
This is exactly what I was thinking of, Oriana. So I'm glad you and I are of similar minds there. It's going, does that mean we get the dance? So, okay. So, we'll keep a casual eye on this. I quite honestly am slightly more interested in this than a certain second season of a certain show. Yeah. So, which is presumably continuing on, at least right now. So, we'll if there's more like remarkable, interesting news on this front, we'll note it. Otherwise, it's like, well, they're trying. Good luck to them. But no, the main thing is, as we mentioned, all these new movies. It's really the thing that gets me about this, and I mentioned this before, is that Mike DeLuca, who was one of the two guys in charge of in charge of this new enterprise for Warner Brothers Discovery, is not an unknown name when it comes to the adaptations. He was very heavily involved on a corporate level with New Line Cinema around the time of the original movies, as in fact was let go rather publicly due to the fact that he was how to put this one of those white guys who screwed up is the best way to put it. There's a confessional article that we'll link in the show notes some time back. This is public knowledge about how various forms of an awful person, but he's better now. Well, maybe, but how interesting is it that some people get second chances like that? Let's put it that way. Yeah, it's sort of like and all that. And again, it's all too vague. Zaslav is too much of a crust. There's all sorts of bad vibes already, is the best way to put it. It's kind of weird, and I don't know. Although we do want Oriana to get a film, so we'll take back everything we said. If
I will dispel the bad vibes personally if you can just give me a movie. But if the product comes out not as in line with my vision, I will promptly disavow it. I'll pull a Doug Liman on the Bourne Identity. Where he apparently Doug Liman was complaining quite a bit about Universal in the aftermath of the release of the Bourne Identity, and a Universal executive literally told him that they would ensure he never worked in this town again. So I'm looking forward to having that happen.
You see, we're just planning all our moves here. It's what we do on By-The-Bywater. We're just looking ahead. So
very strategic thinkers here.
Yeah, exactly. So who knows with this? nah, we'll just have to see. It resolves a certain issue that was always up in the air when Embracer got the rights, and there were noises about, potentially going a third route. As it is, what is perversely interesting about this, if that is the word, is now Amazon's production is even more hung out to dry on its own, in its own universe. So that'll be... Boy, well, welcome to the weird world we're in now, folks. It's just
like thinking about this. I don't know exactly what happened, how Embracer did this deal, because it's weird to me that Warner Brothers Discovery, I guess it was Warner Media when this was happening. But it's odd to me that they themselves did not attempt, and maybe they did and we just didn't hear about it, to get these rights themselves and lock them up internally. That's so interesting to me. How was this done under cover of night? Like, I need some sort of TikTok, not the app, like the type of story that takes you through all the lead up to a deal. I really want one of those. So if any like entertainment journalists out there who have the clout to do that are listening, please explain how this happened.
And we will know that as of yet, there's no zero indication about what exactly this means in terms of whether or not the War of the Rohirrim anime will just be now sort of a hanging there one-off as further plans are developed, or if that's going to become more central. We'll see. It could come down to how successful it is when it comes out next year, and that is still on the cards. Production is continuing. We know that much. The Jackson team was looped in for a comment, and that could mean anything. I really doubt they're going to be directly involved, but...
Right? God, isn't he just...
He's got to be so tired.
So tired.
Yeah, that's kind of my thought. It's sort of like it's been a quarter of a century. Time has moved on, and he's hip deep in the Avatar movies because Cameron went down there, and that's Weta and Stone Street and all that. That's where they're filming those. They're doing those. He's not. Jackson's not hurting for money. So,
he certainly isn't.
I mean, Oriana said the only circumstances under which you'd accept is if you had to write a movie. I would want just an entirely different take. Like I know in my heart it's just going to be a watered down imitation of the Jackson movies. I know it's going to be that because that's what everybody thinks Lord of the Rings looks like.
Yeah.
Right.
What I want is for maybe each movie looks totally different. I don't know. Maybe like just for it to be a different take, and it's not going to be that, but I want it to be that.
Yeah.
We dare to dream. But we will see. We will note further that they were explicit, at least for now, on record, saying that they weren't planning on doing any remakes of the Lord of the Rings film trilogy. Okay, and we'll see. So again, life goes on. But let's talk about something else. Let's talk about something a little more freeing. Let's talk about the choice of subject this time, which is well timed given Jared's announcement, and that's precisely the plan. It is Jared's choice of topic. So please, the floor is yours.
I did pick this hoping that I'd be able to announce the book on the same episode and be like, now I can maybe talk about process, like as somebody who builds fantasy worlds, apparently, be able to like sound like I know what I'm talking about and not just be like some weirdo on the internet. But
it's a thin line.
It's a thin line. So world building. Yay! Funny story, when you go to the Wikipedia article for world building, the map of Middle Earth is the page image.
Oh my god.
Yeah, that's the end of the funny story. I knew I'd be in over my head here, like trying to talk about Tolkien's world building, and I was right. What I kind of intended, like what I've been thinking of when I picked this topic, was to look at his influence here, because he's foundational to modern fantasy, you might have heard. You're either like Terry Pratchett famously said something like, you're either like, he's like Mount Fuji, you're either looking at him or you're standing on him. Whatever that quote is. But that's kind of the problem. Like it's too big. And that's also a blessing because there's just so much and we don't have to talk about it all. We'll see where it goes. Tolkien is not the first to build imaginary worlds. Nobody's the first. It's a thing we do when we're kids. But there's a specific sort of, like I want to say, granular world building that you can think of him as launching. And you know what I'm talking about because you've read or seen any fantasy of the last 50 years. Like there's a world, it might be related to ours, it might not be. It has lands with funny names. The story might visit some of them, it might not. There's a map, there's politics, there's cities, various cultures for the protagonists to wander into. There might be gods. There might be consistent naming conventions that don't refer to anything outside the story. It's a world intended to be believable on its own terms. I kind of, again, feel like I don't need to define this kind of world building. It's what people think of as world building. But what I kind of wanted to look at, I guess, is what did it mean to him? But also, why did this become the kind of world building that everybody does? As far as what it meant to him, we've talked about subcreation a lot, which is an umbrella under which he'd probably put world building. It's the other main driver of his creative process alongside language. Subcreation basically just means working with the tools of creation, of reality, the real world, to produce something new. For him, this was kind of a religious experience. Like if you literally, if you read his letters, he's always like, just do that anyway, but he's talking about it as if it's almost a form of meditation or prayer. Because since God is a creator and humans are made in his image, and Tolkien was Catholic, logically humans must be creators themselves. And I think this belief in the sort of sacredness of fiction really suffuses his work, and I think that's part of where the power comes from. Because he famously hated allegory. You might have heard, but you can see in his world building the way he works through a sort of set of logic problems to kind of reconcile Catholic morality with his own interest in various mythologies and with his experiences in World War One. Like the world of Arda is created by a good omnipotent God, and yet the most horrible evils are permitted to exist within it, kind of like our world, depending what you believe. And this allows him to put forward theories of why the world might work this way and examine things like the big questions: free will, fate, good, evil, jewelry, all of that, in a way that defamiliarizes them and sets them apart. It's important to really get into jewelry. It is so important to look at that.
We're not denying.
There is a lot of jewelry.
There's so much jewelry. Again, I would say this is part of why his world building is endlessly fascinating. He thought that a world feeling expansive and true to life would make its moral exploration more gripping, whereas allegory, where nothing can exist that doesn't feed into the message, can come across as kind of airless and moralizing, which is not the same as having a moral. And a story set in a world that feels real but isn't can get its point across in a much more nuanced way than one set in a world that doesn't feel real and isn't, and in a much, much different way than a story set in the real world itself. It's kind of like, it's like pulling concepts from the real world and putting them into the sort of terrarium. Like you don't necessarily see their natural behavior, but you do see new aspects of their behavior.
A petri dish.
If you have reptiles, I'm sure there's a connection too you can draw to the way he thought about constructed languages. We went into this in our episode on A Secret Vice, how creating a language to express meaning allows you to explore meaning as well as language itself in a new way. So creating a world similarly allows you to explore meaning and the world itself in a new way. That might be a thing to come back to during this episode. And again, this is the kind of topic, I think, where it's easy to be incredibly general and vague about it, or incredibly specific. So I'm going to finish up my meandering now. And my first question, which might be more an Oriana question or a me question, since I don't know if you've ever tried your hand at this kind of fiction, but I'm curious if either of you have any experience doing this kind of world building, and if so, what were you trying to achieve with it?
All right, Oriana, kick it off.
Me first? Oh,
yes.
No. Yes, I have done this several times to varying degrees. Like some of the stories that I have told take place in a world much like ours, but, there is some kind of catastrophe that has happened that has changed things, and thinking through those changes. I have also attempted worlds that are much less based on ours. I think I'm less successful in doing that. And for me, I think part of that just stems from, I can see images in my head and try to translate them into words, but the opposite is, so I have like a lot of trouble with taking abstraction and putting it into words. I'm much better when I have actually experienced a thing.
Yeah, well, right. What do you know? The old.
Yeah, like going off of that. Exactly. It's much easier for me to do that. But it's always so interesting thinking about using world building as this lens, as this sort of magnifying glass on how do you experience the world? What is the world to you? And how do you recreate, or how do you use that to create your own? I'll stop there and let Ned and Jared talk about that.
Well, to throw my hat into the ring, I have not done anything quite as systematically, or at least in terms of some sort of, persistent creative outlet as you two have. It's not that I haven't tried. I still look back with fondness of the time when I was actually doing NaNoWriMo, and if you know, you know, for a while there in the 2000s. Most of which, however, were just essentially sort of genre exercises or things that were, one was particularly very interior. Another one, oddly enough, the first one I ever did, even though the scenario was completely different, I basically used, believe it or not, The Hobbit as a model for action within it, because I'm like, well, I know it works. Why not just do this? It was by no means anything like The Hobbit, but it was sort of like the beats and the pacing, sure. And I had a weird idea that if I ever did a sequel to it, I would actually just go straight on LOTR, even know how it ends, and all that. So, but again, this is stuff set in the modern, quote unquote, the modern world, etc. But yeah, no, what you're hinting at, the sense of whether it's the details and the depths and the things like this, these are the type of things that I tend to more appreciate seeing what others do than me tasing out that impulse on my own. My writing as such is more or less mostly nonfiction reflective. Yeah. The personal essay crossed with all the 8 million music reviews I've done, which is what I'm most well known for. So it is not that, again, I don't have random ideas, but that's really all they are. My own particular stumbling block for anything in depth is that I'm really fun with descriptions. I'm terrible with dialogue. This is my deep weakness, and I stumble across that every time. So pretty much that's another reason why it's sort of like I can do interior reflections, but that's kind of about it. And that's not necessarily what people are necessarily coming to fiction for. Maybe there are exceptions, but to get to the point then of world building, yeah, the closest thing I think I've gotten to that, and again, NaNoWriMo was a good hook. There is one particular story I've always wanted to tell, and I found the way to tell it was to actually go much more imaginative and strange. To get into it would take far too long to explain. I basically stalled out at the halfway point. It draws on an example of family history. That gave me the anchor, but then after a while, I realized that instead of actually telling the story straight up, and when I say family history, we're talking like, late 1890s. This is deep family history. There's nothing nearby, and there's very little detail. That gave me some scope to sort of to turn the idea into something much more imaginative, as strange and unusual, and to try and make this sort of thing where, sort of something that is quote unquote not reality bleeds over into reality. It might be something I could still explore, but it's the type of thing that I almost found myself at the turning point of going like, I don't know where this lands. And without making sure how it lands, I can't make sure I need the world to develop and gel in a way that I think would sort of satisfy, essentially, of the three main protagonists, something that would tie it all together in a way that actually makes sense. And this is more a creative writing problem per se than a world building problem. But there is something about the perception about how the characters see this world and how they interact within it that is sort of the thing that's going on there. It's sort of like I essentially transformed what was a formal late Victorian setting into something else entirely. But again, I couldn't sort of found myself going, and then I stopped. And then and I've had one friend who still asks me almost 15 years later, "You're going to finish that?" And I'm like, I don't know how. So maybe one day, maybe that'll be the one thing I actually do as a full length thing I'm satisfied with. But it is, and I'm living in the city it's meant to be referring to, and I still haven't figured out how to do it. So that's kind of my extent of it. But that's kind of a sort of smaller scope type thing, maybe than what you're talking about there, Jared, because my sense of it is, and this is maybe a question to you to sort of spark things off, is the one reason why I think Tolkien himself might be seen as sort of this is the perception of depth. And when I say perception of depth, this is the comment, we've paraphrased it before, and it's the great comment about how basically after the book was a success, everybody who was specialists in very particular areas wanted to know more about X or Y or Z. And, the geologists want to know more about rock formation, the linguists want to know more about language, etc. And this perception of depth is precisely why I think so many people grabbed onto it and used it as a model, because it was at once immediately inviting and had more details, quote unquote, beyond the realms we know. But throwing that back to you, if you want to use that as a launching point.
It's interesting to compare that kind of hinting at depth that he does with a lot of his imitators.
Mm-hmm.
Or people who were influenced by him without being, like, imitating. I see a lot of modern fantasy doing this thing where everything that is mentioned in the story needs to have a purpose within the story itself, which is personally irritating to me. That is not a value judgment. That is just, it bothers me when that happens, partly because I grew up on Tolkien doing the opposite.
Yeah.
I think that this kind of ties into a lot of stuff that we have been talking about over the course of the podcast so far, is that perception of depth of depth.
That too.
Listen to the death episode.
Yeah.
Allows for you to feel like you are part of this world in a way that a more airtight kind of world building does not, or airtight kind of writing, I guess, which is, for me, I forget what my point originally was, but I'm going to talk about my book now.
Feel free.
I was consciously trying not to build a world because I didn't want to get bogged down in the details and start thinking that they had to matter. So characters will mention things repeatedly that actually have no bearing on the story because they don't understand their own history, and that's a big part of it. In Lord of the Rings, people do generally understand their own history, and that's a different, like, that helps with some things. In mine, I didn't want to get into that. I didn't want it to be about making every detail matter. So I don't know if it has the same perception of depth at all. It may or it may not, but I'm trying a different kind of thing than he is, I think, where it's like, I'm not creating a world with clearly defined good and evil powers or whatever, because that's not the question I'm interested in answering.
Yeah. I think that is one thing that is constantly annoying to me about screenwriting and the screenwriting kind of world. You get notes from everyone in the world when you write any kind of script, and many, many, many of the notes are, I don't understand this.
Yeah. And
oftentimes it is small elements that are world building that I'm just like, that is like, these elements are there solely to give that perception of depth. The audience does not need me to explain this. You do not need to understand this. The fact that it exists does not mean that you need to know everything about it. I know that there is sort of this impulse to delve and to understand, like, and that's what brings people to books and media in general. But there is this kind of steadfast refusal on the part of a number of executives and writers themselves to simply not let the mystery be. And it is profoundly obnoxious.
I think from you could say, for the way I would put it, from a consumer point of view, we see two things that have sort of been driven almost to like insane levels of really, and that is, one is what can be sort of popularly understood as the Chekhov's gun scenario. In other words, if you show something, it has to have a meaning down the line. Now that is something that was expressed in a particular dramatic context about live theater. However, the idea is that and obviously there are works of art wherein everything is indeed tying into the whole, fine. But there's this idea that it actually applies across the board. Not really the case. What's so fascinating about so many things, especially the older and one can say less systemized tales and mythologies and things, come down to there are fragments and things that fly out there and just have been incorporated that who knows they come from where. There wasn't any sense of, putting it all together. You tie that in as well, and this is probably one of the reasons why I think we're all like, about the new film plans here, is that all you have to do is look at something like, to use a syncretic mythology, cosmology, something like Star Wars, Star Trek to a degree too, and increasingly it seems Marvel, etc., and all that, where it's sort of like, we will explain every last little bit.
Everything has to be accounted for.
Right. Everything. We need to know how Han Solo got his name. We need to know where the dice in his ship came from.
Yeah.
I don't need to know. I'm so sorry. I don't.
It's sort of like things can just be. Similarly, things can just be here. I mean, something as a world building detail, this is kind of maybe skew whiff from what we've just been talking about, but something that sort of keeps rattling in my brain as an example of something how Tolkien, was able to get perceived depth, was how to have a character comment on events inside the story in a way that makes sense to us as readers, because it feels right. And that is one of my secret favorite characters, Eorith, in Minas Tirith.
She's so great.
she's who is on the one hand a bit of a stereotype on the other hand, I absolutely love the moment where she is featured in the coronation ceremony, not directly, but commenting on it to her, hick cousin or wherever is coming to town, which I always thought was hilarious. And she's explaining that's so and so and things like that. And I'm like, that's the type of thing that I can imagine people doing at a big event or something like that. And you're just explaining, that's the deal. The modern joke you see on, social media or elsewhere where, something happens in a movie theater and you turn to your person sitting next to you and say, hey, that's so and so, where you're tendentiously over explaining it. It's that type of thing because it's sort of like, that's recognizable human behavior. And it's a strange thing to call that world building, but it suddenly gives the idea that, events aren't just simply grand proclamations. They're the people just sort of like hovering in the background and stories going like, how long is this going to take? Where's the restroom? Things
where's
like
the
that.
food?
There's this realism as a double-edged sword. Partly because realism as a concept is not really a thing. Like in fiction, it's not real. It's not reality. It's never going to be reality. It's fiction. But to compare and contrast what people mean when they say realism, I guess, is like in Lord of the Rings, there's all these little details, the perception of depth, all of that, and it feels real. Partly because so much is allowed to just go unexplained. And that's kind of, if you just walk down the street, you're going to be like, I don't know where that building came from. It's just been there. I don't know the order. I live near a place where Ted Bundy used to live. Like, that's not part of my overall narrative. It's just there. Like, I hope it's not part of my overall narrative. I shouldn't have. This is foreshadowing. This is foreshadowing. Anyway, I will lock my doors very securely. But if you even set within allegedly the same universe, if you look at like the way the Rings of Power kind of overutilizes the world with things like the Mithril being all of a sudden the most important thing in the universe. When it's not, and there's no reason for it to be, or like all of the things that it does that we complain about in that episode, which is, I think, a very good episode.
Yes,
agreed.
Is like that's like, again, heavy air quotes, realistic world building taken too far, where everything is in there because it matters. Like you have to think of, like, it's all facts. It's all it's all there. It's like accounting instead of storytelling.
Yeah, it feels kind of like, to take like the term world building really literally.
Yes.
It is like they are building a house that has it's just
you have to climb in through the window. There's no door.
Yeah.
And that's not to say that you can't do that kind of like everything now has a function in the plot thing well, like N.K. Jemisin's what is the trilogy? Broken Earth trilogy.
Yeah.
She teaches like seminars on world building and everything. Like she knows what she's doing, and everything in her book does that thing that generally I hate, where it's anything mentioned is going to be a plot element, however like minor or major, but she does it really, really well, so it works.
Yeah.
And it's never like this thing mentioned in passing is all of a sudden the most important thing in the world. It's like, no, this dangerous animal that you see from a distance will one day like chase you. Like it's that kind of thing is fine. But she's doing it in some of the same ways that Tolkien is, where it's built this way so that she can explore ethical questions. And she's not just answering silly questions that arise out of the world building, like, oh, where did the metal come from, or whatever.
It's
a good series.
one of the I like Dune the book. I actually it took me several tries to read it because there is like a huge barrier, in my own personal opinion. Everyone can feel free to disagree. But for me, there was a huge barrier in the first kind of 100 pages or so, where there's like chunks where they have mentioned a bunch of stuff that, in conversation. And I'm like, cool, I don't know what any of this stuff is, but whatever, I'm rolling with it. And then there's just like a chunk where they will just explain everything kind of in a row. They just sit around
and explain things to each other.
And I was like, this is not really doing it for me. And
I love
again,
Dune
like,
so much.
I know, I ended up, really enjoying it, but that was a huge barrier to entry to me. I think in part because I was used to a very different style of immersion. Let's call it.
Yeah, this puts me in mind sort of like I'm thinking about, and obviously this is to some degree rather limited in terms of just talking about just what we could say, basic fiction. In other words, words on a page, as opposed to, say, creative graphic novels and other things like that, and other ways to which create a world building thing where it's as much visual as it is textual, etc. So, and again, one can also lead into other things as well. I mean, personally, I think a really good example of world building that was done strictly in cinema, but was built up for it with the work on it, is something like to use an English language example, one of my favorites, The Dark Crystal. Which famously, while a syncretic project from Henson and Oz, and then, of course, a team built on it, Brand Proud, of course, being very heavily involved with it, is something that there was a lot of time spent in saying, okay, what does this world look like and how does it work and all that before filming it. And the idea is sort of like, okay, we have a sense of what this is, how even some of the biology works, things like that. How do we represent it on screen? And they do it in a way where they don't hit you over the head with it. You get a very quick narrator introduction, and then you're off. And that's really all you need. And then you're off and running. And the world, to my mind, functions very well as a creative world. But then let's step back to again, sort of straightforward fiction version of it. Okay, let's use a couple of examples here. We mentioned Herbert as a good example. We've mentioned we obviously Tolkien's the one. Le Guin, Earthsea is kind of my other things. So all three of these, to use these three as specific examples, one of which is an alternate Earth, one of which is an alternate history for Earth, one of which is essentially some place, some Earth-like world, except it's mostly water, thus Earthsea, and then finally something that is explicitly science fiction and is some sort of far distant world. All three of them have senses of history built into them, and it's not that history itself equals world building. That's very dumb. You can create all sorts of background annals and nothing may happen. And in the case, of course, of Tolkien, we could say his deal was that unlike Le Guin and Herbert in comparison, he literally had been working on something for decades. He had his own built-in history of a thing to build on from there. Thus, the sense of that, again, perception of depth. He's literally writing on the ruins of the past civilizations and wars that he had come up with, and then extending it further. So that's a difference from where they're coming from. But both Herbert and Le Guin and Tolkien, all of them are trying to sort of feel their way forward, saying, okay, what are the particular rules, the unspoken rules in some cases of these situations? Some of which, as Oriana just pointed out, explicitly, one character is informed by another. Here is the deal, because you do not know, or I am in a new context. What is going on here?
Or but I'm going to tell you anyway.
Yeah.
Which is like half of Dune.
Yeah, ecology. Sit down and let me explain a few things to you. So, and the spice bribes, et cetera, et cetera. Other things are the more workaday stuff. Again, one of the things I absolutely just adore about Earthsea is that magic is not some sort of deep textual lore. It's more like I am the equivalent of a blacksmith. I am doing this basic work. I am being trained in it, and it is work a day. It feels right. Something who's a sort of heir to that would be someone like Stephen Erickson, the book of Malazan, and the sense that there are things that everyone knows what they are, but they're not explicitly delving into explaining what they are, because everyone knows what they are. That is a case of, it's the alternate approach to what Oriana was saying. You can either have your character explain it, as you know, Bob, or you can just simply do it. You're trying to figure out, I'll try and figure it out from context later. So, and these are, but all of these show the different sort of ways that the specialties that people were working in did. Herbert was doing some work with the ecological work and things like that in Oregon, and that still helps inspire the idea. We have Le Guin, of course, anthropology out of our ears. We have Tolkien, comes. I think there is something to the fact that there is some sort of level of formal academic understanding and training of all three of these authors, and of course there are plenty of other authors too. We mentioned Jemison. There are many other ones we can throw in. Even something, and I'll end on this point. A good example of how a world can be built in a way that again gives that sense of depth in even a quote unquote simpler way is someone like Lloyd Alexander in the Chronicles of Prydain, which has the advantage that his stories for that were created after the fact. He was drawing on Welsh mythology. He had something to work with, but he was creating his own world with it. And you got a sense that he was exploring it all. And there were contexts, whether it's Dalben, whether it's where, Henwin the pig came from, whether it's this, whether it's that. And Taran is feeling his way forward through all the books going like, what's the deal? And things like this, and just start getting used to things. So it's a different dynamic, but there are ways to do it in there. And it's not just, as I said, just history. It's in how characters communicate with each other. It's how they understand the world around them. And to bring it back to Tolkien, I mean, it's just so wonderfully well done in many points. That's the thing of it. That really is the thing of it.
I think for me, the line that reflects Tolkien's world building prowess the most, or at least the one that like really, really sticks with me, is when Aragorn is talking about how, the cats of Queen Beruthiel.
Yeah.
That's the one that just like it's immediately like understandable to the reader. You don't need to know the historical context. You don't need to know who Queen Beruthiel is, but the fact that there was one and that she had cats, like, it's just such an impeccably crafted reference / sentence. It's just like, it's a really good North Star, I think, if you're trying to figure out how to just add these nice little touches, drop in some texture into your world.
The sort of similar example that I always think of is of like a reference that doesn't actually tell you anything except that this thing exists, is in the Barrow in Fellowship of the Ring. And you don't really know where the barrows came from. You just know they're kind of cursed places. That's it. The hobbits are kind of like, we've heard of these. I think they're bad. Like, they don't really know for sure. But when they're captured by a Barrow Wight, and there's this whole like creepy horror sequence and all that, when they get out of there and they've been like freed from this enchantment, and Merry says something about the men of Carn Dûm came after us, and we were worsted. I forget the exact phrasing. And it's like, you don't know anything about Carn Dûm. You don't know any of that. You just know that this history that has not really been part of their lives suddenly just interrupts into it. And that's it. I mean, they get the cool knives out of it and all that, but that moment, like when I was a kid coming across that for the first time, I was like, oh my God, what is that? Like, what is going on here? And you never find out. Yeah. I mean, if you read the appendices, it's kind of in there in a summarized form, but it's not part of the plot. And it's just such an eerie experience for everybody involved. And if you read my book, it'll make a lot of sense to you why that's the one I'm thinking of all the time.
Read the book.
Yeah, read the book. But the way that the characters' lives in Lord of the Rings are reckoning with one part of the world's history for most of the story, because they have to get rid of this ancient evil ring, and they're like traveling through historic places and all of that. But there are all these moments where kind of an other part of history intrudes on their lives, good or evil, and just that happening makes it feel like such a well-rounded functioning universe, even if it's a completely fantastical thing, like Merry remembering some dead guy's memories.
It's only occurred to me now, another sort of interesting detail, and of course we did have our food episode, is that again, Tolkien does not talk about food much. In a weird way, this actually helps world building, precisely because the notable meals get attention. The quotidian ones don't. Yeah. There is, for instance, to give you a good example, we know the Fellowship takes a fair amount of time to get from Rivendell to Moria. We have zero detail about what they're eating the whole time. We have zero detail about handling any of that. It's not important. It's just simply accepted. It's what's there. Another sort of example, and again, this may be something that shows Tolkien's strength, is that he has and this kind of, it's kind of building on what Oriana said. That's a wonderful depth of deal. The idea that language has built-in references that, again, people understand and don't need to tendentiously explain. Another good example are all the various proverbs that he comes up with. Some of which are obviously derived or have equivalents of, you could say, the real world, but other ones feel like, they could be self-contained, very much a more Middle-earth thing on its own or something like that. These senses of how it's sort of like you don't need to have someone explain the simile or metaphor to you. You just take it on board, go like, okay. And then and which is, of course, which is again also Oriana's point with the Queen Beruthiel reference. It's exactly meant to be that. It explains it without having to tendentiously explain it. And again, that certainly reflects Tolkien's strength when it comes to world building. But it's true. I mean, how often do we use all sorts of bits or fragments? Even if we're not closely quoting proverbs at each other, we're quoting turns of phrase.
We're quoting vines.
These definitely are important.
I do think there's a sort of common misconception of Tolkien as being extremely granular, and he's actually not. There's a lot you don't know, like what's Aragorn's tax policy, but what are the sewers of Minas Tirith? There's a lot that isn't actually there because it doesn't need to be talked about. And I think that's one place where some of his imitators fall down, is having to be like, well, here's where the sewage is going. And it's like, it's a city. They're taking care of that. It's fine. You don't actually need to know that.
Yeah, that's not in, given that the Lord of the Rings is a history book in some sense.
The audience know, like the in-universe audience knows already, or wouldn't need to know. They're just like, it's a city. Like it's like they've got handles.
Where in your history book do they talk about the sewers of? I mean, unless it's like, you know,
I mean, if it's Rome, they talk about it a lot because every history book gets really into the sewers of Rome,
but
for some reason.
Yeah.
They just really wanted to know. It's all those aqueducts, let me tell you.
I actually did we took a tour of a museum. It's, I think, at the Canal House Museum in Amsterdam, which is interesting. That talks about the creation of the canal system from its earliest days and the introduction of like a more modern sewage system, and how most of the houses on the inner ring of Amsterdam like didn't get sewage until 1980.
Oh, I knew it was going to be some horrifying number. I didn't expect it to be that horrifying.
I suppose we could go down further this road, but that would take us a little further afield.
Some real world building.
Yeah, exactly. So, where's the parking in Minas Tirith? What? And all that. You put your chariots over there. But keeping an eye on the time, maybe we should move into sort of a wrap-up mode. On my own, if I have a final thought, world building as a concept is one of those things that, I would say less is more is kind of what works for me best, and I think we'd all agree with that. You provide enough, and then people can sort of add on to that. I've been doing a lot of thinking about just some of the work of one of my favorite all-time authors, another English author, another academic, and about a generation earlier than Tolkien, the horror short story writer M.R. James, who, his things are set in our world or earlier versions of our world, but the man is atmosphere brilliantly down, and he puts you right into it very, very well. He matches certainly with his knowledge with that. And again, there's short stories they're eventually contained. It's just enough, and it's so vivid at its best when he puts you into things, whether it's simply the modern tale of a Boy Scout troop that stumbles across something, or something that's strictly antiquarian records. They're just it's very well done. There is no one approach, but I find that if you hint and let people let you as the reader sort of fill in things, or just speculate, or just sort of like and all that, it comes richer as a result, instead of having to turn to an appendix every 20 words and going like, what is this again? So that'd be my take.
I think there is a tendency amongst newer or younger writers to think of world building as sort of a checklist. You have to include this element, this element, this element. You have to create a language. You have to create, you have to know all of these things.
As checklist, that's way more important than it actually is, too.
Yes. Yes. And I think that if you are someone who enjoys just let things take you, Tolkien, stuff just popped up. And he rolled with it.
Like Treebeard. Like, that's a huge element of world building that just happened. And he was like, okay, well, I got to make this work now. And then he did.
Well, now I have these talking trees. How do I explain this?
Got to go back and edit the Silmarillion. Like,
yeah.
And Jared, to close it out?
Oh, this feels like the start of a new discussion, but one thing that we didn't really get into is the way that because he was so freaking Catholic, the way he looks at things like divine grace or fate or cosmic intervention in the lives of his characters is something that, like, in quote unquote good world building, you wouldn't have, because this god can do whatever this god wants to do. Why isn't this god wanting to do it? Like, it creates all these problems. But I think that's one of the most interesting and powerful parts of this story, even if I don't agree with him on a lot of other stuff, is that this feels like a universe where anything can happen in a good way. Like, divine grace can just intrude on your life and be like, actually, the quest is going to turn out okay, which has its detractors as a concept. Like, it's just a bedtime story because everything will be fine. And it's like, no, clearly it won't for most of these people.
Yeah.
A lot of these people are dead already. It's not going to kind of fine. But that kind of world building, I get heavy air quotes, I suppose, I don't really know, I think is part of why the book is still so fascinating, is that there is this system of divinity that's operating unseen, and you just get little hints of it. And the way that he uses that to look at things like coincidence and pity and love and emotional transformation as drivers of the story is really, really cool. And it's not like good world building, but it's his world building.
right, time to look ahead to the next episode and the topic for it. The choice of topic has come back around to me, so it's that time. It's April. It's our anniversary episode. Our first one was April 2019, but April also means April Fool's Day, and for the last few years I've been springing things on my co-hosts that usually make them go like, do we have to? And I'm like, oh, well, I don't know. But now, what I'm about to say we're going to do is something that we're actually recording this fairly quickly, so it'll be just a couple of weeks from now. We're sort of getting back under our schedule where we'll have the episodes start coming out more at the start of the month like we normally do. So we needed something light, something we know, something I said I wouldn't make them do before, but I think we gotta. I think we have to. We've been touching on this adaptation and that thing over time and all the rest of it. But my friends,
I have a knife ready.
Yeah, you should have that knife ready. You thought it was going to be this last year. It turned out to be something else. That's when we talked about Bakshi's Lord of the Rings. But it's time, my friends. The Rankin Bass Return of the King.
Man.
I knew it. You knew it was coming because when there's a whip, there's a way.
I don't want to watch it now.
One last time.
I don't want to watch it.
I think this is the loudest Jared has ever been on the podcast.
I think so too. I think I have broken the poor man. I believe me. As I said, we need to think of this as a good venting session.
There we go.
Oh boy, and hey, it's shorter than Rings of Power. In fact, I think it's about the same length as a typical episode of Rings of Power. So
Yeah,
that's okay.
Bright side,
I could deal
bright
with
side.
it for that. Yeah. If I could get through the Rings of Power, I can get through.
You can get through this straight shot, and then you never have to think about it again. But I'll detail my own history with this thing. It is unfortunately formative for me in my association with Tolkien, alas. So it'll give me an excuse to talk about some other stuff. But yes, we'll all have a chance to say this. Yeah, the Rankin Bass Hobbit. This is not. They produced it, but we'll have more to say. So anyway, that'll be in just a few weeks here. So just have a chance to watch it again, and this will be fun in quotes. But more seriously, in terms of something better than that, that is going to be our 49th episode, of course. But the episode after that will be our 50th, and that is something we are planning on doing something rather more elevated for, if you will, at least definitely different. As we've said before, this is going to be our first live episode, and when we said live initially, the idea would be sort of like three of us in one place actually recording it, and I think the initial idea was that maybe just sort of like meet up somewhere in Portland and just have a chance to chat in the room, just have something fun that way. It's since become more elaborate. Now we do not have we don't have full exact details to share quite yet, but we do have a date. The idea will be that this will actually be a live recording in front of an audience. If you're able to show up, of course, we don't expect everyone in the world to show up to Portland on this date. Be nice if you can, though. So if you happen to be in the area or just in the Pacific Northwest and can make it, please do. It is going to be on a weekend. If you are available on Saturday, April 22nd, to be in Portland, that is where we will have a recording of the episode in the evening. It will be part of a larger thing that is being organized by our wonderful host at Megaphonic, Chris Puma, will be flying out for it. There may, in fact, be more than one podcast in the network that will have an episode recorded at this event. We still don't know the details. Things are still very much in flux, but that is the idea. All three of us will be there to do an episode, and there may, as I said, be other podcast episodes recorded. We'll make a thing of it. It will be sometime in the evening, so just keep that in mind. If you can make it, great. If you can't make it, you're just going to be hearing about it, and that will be our 50th episode. We will have much more details and specifics next time through for our next episode, so we'll have more for you at that time. Other than that, we gave you a lot of news. We hope we've given you some stuff to think about. We'll have much more to say next time, including the screams of agony from my co-hosts as they have to watch the Arthur Rackham-style Hobbits again and things like that. So here we go. But slightly more seriously, thank you all very much, as always, for listening each time. Again, you know where to find us. We used to leave our little tag in the original form of the outro, but again, megaphonic.fm/By-The-Bywater, and we do have our episode episode guides up for all the other things, and you can reach out to us there and elsewhere if you have any questions and things like this. Do consider joining the Megaphonic Patreon. We've had more and more people be joining over the past few weeks, so that way they can join in on the Discord where we can have sorts of discussions. Special shout out to one of our regulars, there's Matt Schneider, who's been going through the Silmarillion and been entertaining us with his roasts and reads. We really appreciate that over the thing. And yeah, hey, if you want to join in, that's where to find us. So we're doing a lot of talk there and much more besides. So we look forward to seeing you all next time, and we will talk to you then. So until then, thank you.